Good afternoon, Scott Baker, Ellie Chamberlain. Good to see you both.
You guys are all looking pretty good, and everybody at home, thanks for joining us on Lead Better. If you're listening later, we are just as glad that you're listening on your podcast app. Today's field note that we're going to talk about is entitled "Letting Your Language Take the Temperature Up and Down in a Room." And I like this, what was unusual about it was we just did some recording. Ellie was part of that for a new module that will be part of one of our major components of Admired Leadership. And one of our partners kind of used an illustration about this idea of a leader being sort of a thermostat, right? That every culture has a weatherman. We're always looking for that. And I like that. I like that image. And so the idea that you as a leader can affect the climate in the room feels very important to me.
Every culture has a weatherman.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weatherman's a universal thing. We always want to know what's the weather going to be. Right.
Right.
Well, then you as a leader, you start to project what's the weather going to be for your team.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And
No,
it's interesting
totally.
because I think teams look to the leader to tell them what the weather is outside. Like you can look outside and see if it's raining, but if your leader says it's really pouring, that's a little different than just a sprinkle. So it's kind of
Yeah.
you're the weatherman, but I also can't look outside to confirm.
Yeah. Right. Yes. And if the leader's like, we're all about to be hit by a tsunami, run, run.
Okay.
You're like, okay, it's worse than I thought. The first quarter results were not as good as they were trying to make out. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
So when we look at this one is actually about language, which is why it's great to have Ellie around, because Ellie always has a way of phrasing things. And some of you who are in our main platform know that, like, boy, I like those videos where she's the ending thought because she just has a way of getting right to it. So what do we think about this idea in terms of the way a leader can use a lexical diversity, vivid language, tone to sometimes calm things down, right? To really kind of drag it down, and sometimes to really energize the place. Is that manipulative? Can that be is that too much of a technique, or can that be something that is authentic for a leader to do? Ellie.
Yeah, we get this question a lot actually of manipulation, or is it, and I like to reframe it to being strategic. So
Mm-hmm.
we know from the research that there's three different types of communicators. Expressives, they say what they mean. Think of a toddler.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
express what they want. Conventional, which it depends on the room that they're in. So if it's a birthday party, they'll act happy. If it's a funeral, they'll act sad. And then you have strategic communicators can turn a funeral into a birthday party or a birthday party into a funeral based on what they say.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that the language that you use can change that temperature of the room. It can tell people what the weather is and how they should react
Mm-hmm.
to it. It's not manipulative, it's strategic. I would say the main word I would take away from today's field note is intentionality. Rather than coming into a room and using the language you always use or saying the things you always say, how can you be more intentional about the words you use, your lexical diversity,
Mm-hmm.
and the weather that you're bringing into the room by choosing what you say or what you don't say or how you say it?
Well, and maybe that part of that is then the change. Like if you normally talk one way, but all of a sudden you're a little more intense, Mikey, would then you react to be like, oh, something's happening here.
Yes. Now, I wouldn't necessarily react that way if I just noticing that he's saying it, that a leader is saying it in a different way, right? But the reaction, man, it can really set me off. And going back to your weatherman kind of illustration of this is like I wonder if the weather people that you worked with actually had like different stages of elevation of like trying to convince people this is a really bad one. And having like reserve some language for when it actually is going to get really bad in the future.
Well, as a good point. So I worked here in Pittsburgh for a long time with a weathercaster named Joe DiNardo, and he was actually more famous for being a little grumpy about overhyping things. So when all the other stations were like, "Oh, you better go stock up, run to the grocery store, there's not going to be school," he'd be like, "It's going to be a couple inches." And he would say that on the air, and because sometimes they'll be like, "Well, they're saying 8 to 12." He goes, we have mountains. Like the mountain is going to get, 8 inches. In the city, it's going to be like a half an inch. And people are like, but everybody was saying it's this huge storm. So he was always trying to do the weather, but mostly calm things down. Now, there was a time or two where that, maybe didn't work out quite. So, it's not an exact science. But I think that's really helpful, right? And I think the idea of saying that we really do, like, people are driven by emotional expectation of what's happening and what's going to happen. So there's a responsibility for the leader to think carefully about their words. People are like, Ellie talks about this a lot, about like how people are looking symbolically at a leader. So how they carry themselves, the language that they use, whether it's catastrophic or whether it's optimistic, all of those things are really important here.
Yeah, Ellie, I have a question for you, because so oftentimes we want a leader to repeat themselves for various reasons in communication. Repeating themselves gets a bad name, but we really want people, good leaders, to repeat themselves quite a bit. But if there's a trite statement, like, for instance, we've got somebody that we work with who I've heard him say a time or two, that really puts cream cheese in my shoes. It's so vivid, and you know exactly what they mean as soon as they say it. But I don't hear him say it too often. And I sometimes wonder
right.
if that becomes like, as soon as he feels like he's becoming famous for saying something, like, he immediately like cuts it out of his vocabulary, right?
Yeah. I was just gonna say, yeah, I think you withhold until you either need to light a fire or you need to assuage the situation. And I think the cream cheese in your shoes example, Mikey, is so good because it's such, like, you can feel the energy. Like you can actually feel what that means. I loved the example too at the end of the field note where it talks about a leader withholding when they curse. I had a parent that never cursed unless it was a really big deal. And you knew if they threw out one word or another word, like, you were in big trouble because it never happened. So how do you withhold, but also, like, how do you create the feeling that you want people to have by using that specific phrase? Or I actually don't like the cream cheese example because I can't get it out of my head whenever he uses
It's too
it.
weird,
That's all I'm
right? It
thinking
is
about.
very weird.
But yeah, how do you translate that based on what the audience needs or what the team needs or what you need them to do? I think is the interesting part. I think too, the question we get asked all the time is, like, what does this look like when you're going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting every day, or walking into a room, and how do you make that intentional choice every day, and how do you make time for it? Which I think is the biggest challenge, is making time to be deliberate or intentional in those pieces.
I have a question that I need to represent from the comment section over on Substack. So Pascal asks specifically, are people truly motivated by only projecting the positive still? Are people not looking instead for accuracy over feel-good vibes? Like, isn't that where intrinsic motivation would come from?
Intrinsic motivation being a very important thing, but sometimes, oftentimes negative language drives people. I'm not using fear as like, I got to terrify you, but like when we sense loss or the loss of opportunity, sometimes that actually is a bigger, more intrinsic motivator for people individually. Sure. But regardless, I get the point of saying, is just a leader changing language actually going to change the hearts and minds of the people on the team? And I think the one thing that we're underlining here is it's a combination of things from a leader, but the specific example, just to kind of go to what Pascal is talking about here, the field note talks about a leader using language like happy. Okay, that's modest emotion. If you said, well, I'm satisfied, okay, you get a sense of lesser emotion. But if you go, I'm thrilled with this, like I couldn't be more ecstatic, then you start to get a different way of saying the same thing, but within shadings. It's kind of like the old, Eskimos have 42, words for snow. I don't even know if that's true, right? So I think the idea being that in language, and what was it Huxley said, words are the strings upon which we hang our existence, right? This is all we have, like, in the way we communicate with each other. So the more sophisticated you are in using the words to kind of set that thermostat in the room, the better, I would say.
Yeah, and I would think too about like a conversation maybe that you recently had that went sideways. It went awry. It got heated too quickly. And I
Mm-hmm.
always kind of think back on those conversations. Maybe it's with the spouse, maybe it's with the friend. What did I say that turned the volume up a notch?
Might have
And
been
how
just the
could
wrong
I
word.
it yeah, the wrong word, the
Mm-hmm.
wrong phrase. That's ridiculous, instead of, oh, let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about that, right? Like,
Right.
I think even it's not even the motivation, but it's the conversation that you're able to have to get to the desired results. If you're using more hotter language rather than a cooler tone, you can actually change the outcome of the conversation. So I
Yeah.
think it's not the only thing that matters, but it definitely matters.
Well, Ellie, I think it'd be a good idea if you kind of told us in very specific detail some of these conversations that went wrong for you recently.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think my husband would love that idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Um, now, do you, this isn't specifically to the idea of the leader turning up the thermostat, but I literally come sometimes into my detached office here away from my house. Sometimes I'm in here all morning. Today I had to take my mother to the airport. I didn't get the heater turned on in this room until recently. And so it was in the teens here in Pittsburgh this morning. It's going to be in the 70s this weekend. I'm very cold right now. And I like the cold. I take cold baths. I like saunas, all the rest of that. I'm guessing you guys are pretty comfortable. But when people say to me, um, you know, oh, it's really awful out there, or it's really cold out there. I always remember the time when I was like 12 years old and I went to go hear Zig Ziglar speak, the grandfather of motive. Maybe I was a little bit older. And I remember his old thing about carry your weather inside you. It's what's inside you. And I always say it's always sunny and warm, wherever I am, right? Because and I'll joke about that, but I kind of mean it. And so the idea is not only that a leader can set the thermostat in the room, but to some extent, the leader needs to be setting their own thermostat so that they're not buffeted by the ups and downs of the market any more than they would be by the ups and downs, of the weather. So I'm jealous if you're in comfortable rooms right now, but it's keeping me alert. But I think it's not a bad thing for leaders to have this thermostat metaphor in mind.
Yeah.
I think it works.
And without getting too woo-woo, the idea of a meditative practice that actually helps you really practice this is important to do if you find yourself, being distracted by other people's language or other people's emotions in a way where you'd like to stay calm, but you can't. A meditative practice is something that is important for some people if you haven't done that before, and if you find yourself out of control in those kinds of situations as well, then you need to recognize that these are things that you could separate and practice and get better at. It's just because it feels a little woo doesn't mean you shouldn't practice these things.
Yeah, and I think it's important to your point, Scott, of you bring the weather with you, but you also
Mhm.
bring the weather of the team with you.
Mm-hmm.
And you can turn that thermometer up and down just based on how you're sitting in the room, what you say, and all those things go together, but they're really looking at you to tell them what the weather looks like and how they should react.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
as a kid,
Go ahead.
as a kid, my position in my family as a kid was as like the mediator. So I'd always look for like potential conflict and step in and try to like help everything be
Mhm.
okay. If you go into situations like that as a leader, you're not necessarily accomplishing the goal that is best for you in that moment. So what is the frame of mind that you do have, not as a peacemaker, but as somebody else, right? You end up maybe deploying some of the same skills that you have as a peacemaker in your family, but it's not for the same type of thinking, because sometimes you want to elevate things that doesn't seem peaceful at all, right? And so if I'm not being a peacemaker here, what am I exactly? Maybe the weather person analogy is the best way to kind of go through this.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like we use it a lot, like, I think also a coach of like you can
Mhm.
escalate or de-escalate, you can elevate performance, you can
Mhm.
slow down. It's the middle of the game, or it's the last 2 minutes of the buzzer, and we have to push up. Like I do think you're coaching your team on where to lend their attention, where to lend their time. So maybe it's the weather. I like the idea of the kind of the barometer, but I also like the idea of coaching your team to know when it's an urgent situation, when it's a
Mhm.
buzzer beater, when it's actually, we're in the middle of the game and we're up 4 points, so maybe we don't need to exert all that energy.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being like a 1,500 meter run, and you know that you have to end with a big kick. And now you're running with 7 people, right? And so you want to somehow be able to accomplish this in a way where you're crossing the line near the same time. What's the kind of pace that you would do? Sometimes it feels like you're slowing everybody down. Sometimes it's you're reserving energy. But now here you're yelling at everybody to get that kick in, right? People need to know that your yells are good yells, right?
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think bringing it back to the beginning of the field note, because it was saying the whole thing that we're driving here is sometimes the leader needs to add urgency. Sometimes they need to bring some calm, some stability, like whatever's happening in the room. And what I do notice is in the best leaders, and we've looked at this, and I heard one person kind of say, think back to Mayberry, where Andy Griffith was the sheriff, and sometimes there'd be terrible things going on, but he was always calm. He was always sort of enjoying what was going on. He was moving a crisis to a better position. And in a way, that's how we actually like to see our leaders. And we see corporate leaders, governmental leaders, the ones that look panicked, the ones that look like things are kind of tense and falling apart, we withdraw from that. So I think a leader can bring this sort of a calm, even enjoyability, even when there is urgency, to when they then just tweak that to be like, all right, let's step it up now. But it's not we got to step it up, right? I think you can kind of keep that tier of calm enjoyability that can still drive to urgency or bring it down to stability, but you're always signaling we're going in the right direction. Things are going to be good. I like doing this with all of you. Let's go do it.
Great. Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Thank you. I'm going to call it 16, 17 minutes here. I think it was a great conversation. Thank you for joining us, Ellie. And for those that are listening online or listening later, if you like the idea of listening by way of a podcast, we've got those feeds available on both Apple and Spotify as well. And some people, enjoy not looking at us as we talk. And so if that's you, there's your option. All right. We'll talk again tomorrow. Thanks to you both for this opportunity.
See ya.
Thanks for having me.
Bye now.